and for the IIQM to make this happen. So I will start with, this is the title of the presentation today. So I'm going to talk about this dissertation project that I conducted in China, primarily in county seat and the surrounding rural areas in North China. I did this study when I was a doctoral student at Indiana University. And the pilot study started from 2011, and I defended my dissertation in 2017. So it's a long-term project, and during, to some degree, it's an ongoing project for me, because now I'm trying to, as Juliana mentioned, turn this dissertation into a book manuscript. So your feedback is very much appreciated. Let me move to my next slides. I want to give you an overview of what I plan to talk about in today's conversation, like in today's presentation. So as opposed to a much more like a formulaic presentation, I want to make it more like a narrative of my dissertation journey. So I want to start with what this dissertation is about. And then I want to talk a little bit more about why I was motivated to perform such a study and to reflectively talk about my motivation and commitment to this study. And I will talk about my findings to just to give you a sense of what the study found out and why was it important to us today. And this is the project, and I want to start my story from this picture. And this is a very meaningful picture for my research participants. And it's an old picture taken in 1975 in the Hope High School. It's anonymized. It's a rural high school in Ford County in China. And it's a graduation picture of this. In this picture, there were like 91 rural youths graduated collectively from this high school. And before they left their school, they took this picture in front of their campus. And my study really started with their high school life in this rural place. And all of the 91 participants, all of the 91 youths on this picture, they attended this high school as a cohort from 1973 to 1975. And if you know a little bit about the history of modern China, you know that's the period where the Cultural Revolution was still going on, and there were like radical propaganda about socialist collectivism, and there were also ongoing radical educational reform to change the education from to abolish all sort of merit-based education and to embrace rural-oriented and collectivist-oriented education in the countryside of socialist China. And what I'm interested in is really just to study the experience of the coming of age experience of this high school cohort. And I want to examine and I want to look at how did the rural Chinese youth come of age during a period of radical social changes, namely from the Cultural Revolution to the era of market reforms. And here I define, just knowing that there are multiple definitions and there are debates and tensions about what is counted as the Cultural Revolution among the China historians. So I use a broadly defined definition, which includes the period from 1966 to 1976. And the Cultural Revolution was initiated by China's socialist leader Mao Zedong, and they lasted for about 10 years. And it was characterized by radical political movements, a lot of violence, local violence and conflicts, and the purge of, what they call the bad elements of the intellectuals and those who were identified as class enemies, and also this radical waves of students movements, from the Red Guard movement to the Sandang Youth movement, for example. And the right after the the end of the Cultural Revolution is this era of market reforms, and it started from 1977 to present. And the market reforms is marked by the economic reforms in China to carefully shift from a collective economy to a market-based economy. And also, it was at the same time that China opened its door to the Western countries, to the world, so to speak. And in terms of the realm of education, it started with some radical educational reform to move back, to shift back to the merit-based examinations, to the meritocratic system. So what I was studying in this project is really to look at this turbulence era where a lot of changes happened, a lot of like what people thought to be fixed and correct maybe yesterday suddenly changed to be inaccurate or to be abandoned in the other day. So here, I mean, this is designed as a critical ethnographic study. And as I mentioned, I did the study from 2011 to 2017. And critical ethnography is characterized by researchers' long-term engagement with the research participant, with a prolonged stay in the research site, and also with ethnographers' very strong interest in the everyday life and people's experience. And also, we are particularly interested in the interaction between people's social action and the social structural factors, social, political, cultural, structural factors. So these are, broadly speaking, when I set off to study, to perform this study, these are all the things I'm interested in examining. And here are some of my data. So I have 41 life history interviews with this former high school cohort. When I was doing the study, 6 people in the cohort have already passed away. So among the former cohort who were alive at that time, I interviewed probably like a little bit less than 50% of them. And I also did 6 interviews with the former teachers and administrators, just to get a sense of like how the school was organized at that time and how the educational reform was implemented locally. I also did some participant observations on their, in particular, I'm interested in how they organize their reunions, for example, how they came together to talk about their past, and some focus group discussions. To better understand the historical context when this cohort grew up, I conducted some archival research at the county and the municipal levels. And if for those of you who might be like interested in what's going on in China today, you probably know that the current regime is not very interested in having people examine their difficult past, so to speak. So, so it's not quite easy to get access to the archives, even the local archives. And I had a limited access, but I was able to get some work done there. In addition, on top of this, I did some research using the database that are designated to collect this the relevant data to study the policies and to look at the media report at that time. And so these are like more like the overview of what kind of work I did for this study. And here are some of the pictures. On the left, what you can see is like I was doing this life history interview with my participant in his home, and on the right is the a focus group conversation, and on top of this is the participant observation of a reunion. It was actually at a wedding, and they it's a wedding of one of the research participants' son who got married with another girl. So like people got together to celebrate. And at the bottom, I was doing some home visit. Well, it's actually work site visit with this research participant in a family bakery, and she ran with her son. So here are some of the textual data. Like the data on your left is the letter that one of the participants wrote to her partner in the early 1980s. And on the right is the archival data from the local archive. It's more like it's a form of it's a survey form to talk about the background of the teachers. And here are some of the visual data I collected just to illustrate when I was doing my analysis, like when I was trying to make the connection between the cultural beliefs of individuals and the overarching, in general, the ongoing ideological discourse or a large-scale cultural discourse. I collected some of the posters. Like those are very unique socialist posters to illustrate the connection there. And on the left is the it's talking about like rural youth learning science while at the same time doing revolution. So learning science become a way to revolutionize people's so to speak fate. If we want to tie back to the central theme of the study. And on the right is the it's a depiction of a group of rural women, young women, joining this very hard labor of building dams. So it's a demonstration of women's role in the collectivist countryside, what kind of work they engage in, and also the kind of femininity that the state intended to promote. And the state wanted to see from local, from the young generation, specifically the female young generation. And those are like a brief overview of like what this study is about and what are some of the data I was using. And I want to talk a little bit more about why I want to do this. Because like I think when I was conceiving this study, I got a lot of questions actually from my peers and even from my not many from my mentors, but from like other people around me about why this mattered. Like, why do you want to study something that has already passed for almost a half a century, like 4 decades. And I want to talk a little bit more about that because I was asking the same question to myself. And the first thing I want to comment on is that I realized the study was derived from my theoretical reading. Like when I was in grad school in Indiana, I did a lot of theoretical readings, and I was particularly interested in critical theories. So I read widely the Frankfurt School, the cultural studies, like the contemporary cultural studies tradition, and I read the contemporary critical social theories like Bourdieu or Foucault. So the more I read about this, the more I realized that, you know, one of the theme that we see a lot from this type of theoretical writing is that socialization is the reproduction of social inequality. And children or young people were socialized into this hierarchical social order, and where the social inequality was continued and reproduced. And the more I look at the literature, the more I realize that the writing actually presumed, the writing was very much based on the scholars' study within the developed Western countries. And they presumed the existence of a relatively stable and static social structure. So you feel like the children or the young people, they were socialized into this structure, into different positions of this structure. And then I started to compare where I came from with the I started to compare the two societies that I was relatively familiar most, the contemporary Chinese society and the contemporary American society. I realized that there is something really stood out to me in China. This sort of like this well organized, like this relatively fixed and stable social structure does not exist if we look at the long range, like if we use a longer time frame to look at the development of modern Chinese society. And let me see how I can. Okay. So I had this theoretical question of what if the social structure changes? Like, what if, you know, like we have this hierarchical order? What if the order shuffled? And what if the order was leveled and like people got reordered? So I came up with this question, and I figured out like actually nobody could give me the answer. And then okay, so then I realized that maybe I should just go and explore myself, and maybe an empirical case to study youth identity formation in the era of radical social changes could be something that I could do. So I tried, and I got a lot of encouragement and support from my advisors, and it just turned into my dissertation. And here you could see, like I used two pictures to demonstrate this this radical change. Like in 1949, it was the establishment of People's Republic China, and like what we could see here, this is really just one very typical like a propaganda poster during the socialist era. A lot of political movements, a lot of, you know, charismatic leader, and a lot of worship of the leader, and related with every different social life, different aspects of social life were organized around this. And now you can see, like with the introduction of all the Western with the introduction of the capitalist system, basically, the introduction of all the Western cultures and everything, is China transitioned to the late socialist era. And I want to comment on, like, it is still a very much debatable topic to think about the current era, like, of Chinese society. Like, I was using the term post-socialism at the very beginning of my study, and I got a lot of questions, and like people around me pushed me to think about, is this a era of post or a late socialism? It's like how we look at the legacy of Cultural Revolution, or how we deal with the historical change from the Cultural Revolution to this post or late opening and reform era, is still very much a debatable topic. And nobody really, like, nobody could set a conclusion for us about this. So I just want to, like, as I talk, identify some of the contentious issues that I'm very much interested in thinking with. And so this is like the theoretical, like how the study was first derived as a theoretical question. And then I also want to talk about my intention to bear witness of the country's difficult past. And there are, like, in sociological studies, there are some existing literature about how we memory, or like how we understand our approach, our remember our difficult past. And this could be something collective as opposed to individual. Because if you look at, every country has this difficult past, has a past that the country just want to erase, or the country feel like very difficult to face. And an example in the Western context will be like, in the American society would be Vietnam War, for example. So when they like study how like after the end of the war, how people came up with different ways to memorize it, to remember it. Even if you go to DC to look at the memorial wall of Vietnam, you realize that the wall is like the monument, is a wall with all the names of people who lost their life in the wall. And so if you look at that, that's very different from a monument that highlighting people's how brave they were during the fight, how much, like, how honorable their life was. So so in my case, the Cultural Revolution is definitely the difficult past for the current regime in China and for a lot of the Chinese people. And it has caused a lot of trauma, a lot of tension, a lot of like, if you look at the current cultural phenomena in China, you probably figure out you could find some traces in the previous, like, socialist practice. But like, currently what the regime is trying to do, or what a lot of people is trying to do, is to encourage people to move forward, to look forward to something in future and forget about this difficult past. But I think for me, like, bearing witness of this difficult past is still very important. And I want to look at not only those who remembered, who who have become part of the narrative of this difficult past. I also want to look at those who were silenced, who were marginalized, who didn't get their voice out during this difficult time. So that's that's exactly what happened to this rural youth. I don't like, for the sake of the time limitation, I don't want to go too much deeper into this, but like, I just want to briefly comment that within the study of Chinese youth, you realize if you look at specifically this set of literature, you look at a lot of the literature is set to study the urban youth at that time, because the urban youth, they also suffered a lot from this like political movements, because a lot of the political movements happened in urban areas. But if you want to look at the or even in the literary products, even in the cultural products, like movies, like novels, you see a lot of literature, and even they have particular genres about this to describe the experience of urban youth. But if you look closer and if you want to know what are some of those rural youth, where are some of the rural youth, what were they doing at that period, you couldn't really find much. And I was fortunate enough to have access to this group. And the fact that this group was still very actively connecting with each other, like they were still like having reunions, etc., make me feel like maybe this is the type of social group that I would like to work with. And I want to be able to understand their experience, and like I want their stories to resurface to the historical horizon. And like I mean, I commented like, you know, this matter to me personally because I feel like I grew up in China. I feel like I'm to some degree like I'm still very much connected with this country, and I feel like responsible to I won't say like, you know, the direction of the future of the country, because like I feel like I'm such a small individual, but I to some degree I do feel like I'm responsible to what's going on there. Um, that's pretty much about why I was very motivated to do this project. And I want to briefly talk about the findings of the dissertation. And here there is like a brief chapter overview. Uh, it's organized in a way different from a conventional dissertation. Because in conventional dissertation, doctoral dissertation, you would expect to see first chapter introduction, second chapter literature review, third chapter methodology, and findings in chapter 4 and 5. But here, what I'm doing, what I did is to I kind of write it in a way more like aligns better with an ethnography. I start with the general structural issues, like the discussion about the structural issues of educational reforms and the state ideology about the socialist neo-peasant. And that was exactly the ideological discourse that heavily influenced and shaped the life of my rural participants. And in chapter 2, I talk about their school life. And that's during the Cultural Revolution. And in chapter 3, I talked about right after they graduated from their high school, how they worked in the socialist countryside. And from chapter 4, I moved to this era of post-Mao, post-Cultural Revolution era. I talk about in chapter 4, I talk about the lives of those rural youth whose life course was changed because of the resumption of merit-based examinations, because they were able to test it into colleges and professional post-secondary schools. And in chapter 5, I discussed those who failed or missed our didn't participate those reform educational like reforms and those examinations, and who were pushed into this burgeoning burgeoning space of market, primarily in this rural areas again. And in the appendix, because I'm a methodological major, I'm kind of expected. I was kind of expected to make some contributions about the make some methodological contributions. So I have an appendix to discuss the to reflect on the methodology I use. And here, like just very briefly to go through the findings. Like I talked quite some about this, from the abolishment of all the merit-based examinations during the Cultural Revolution to its resumption right after the end of the Cultural Revolution. I kind of identified that as one of the major structural factors that influenced and shaped the life course of those socialist rural youths, and who they grew up in this rural-oriented and collectivist schooling system. And after the reintroduction of competition, they had to adjust to a world of increasing urbanization and individualization. And I have this picture here. It's a picture, like it's a historical picture of like the resumption of the exams. And you can get a sense of like some of the major historical events going on. And like here, I'm like situating the lived experience of my research participants in this like historical context. And against this structural change, I realized that I recognize that the conversation, the discourse about revolving around fate, in Chinese they call it 命运, is something very emerged as a key theme in the study. So here are just some of the quotes from my conversation with my research participants about 命 or fate. So some of them would say like, studying in the college changed my fate, changed my 命运, 改变了命运. And some of them would say, all my life I just had this fate of being a peasant. I would just, admit it. That's like in the conversation we had years ago. And also some of them would continue to say, I believe in fate, I believe in 命运, but I do not rely on it. So there is this sense of agency. What is the limits of like a person's autonomy, and like whether you could, what are some of the things you could do to change your living live your life. Here, I want to like some of them more about the findings about changing fate. Like the changing fate through merit-based examinations, or GAOKAO. If you look at contemporary Chinese discourse around this, you realize that it is still a myth there. Like people would involve in all kinds of debates about whether these kids from disadvantaged family backgrounds, whether they could still change their fate through attending those college entrance examinations. But their like a referential point would be this educational reform started in 1977. Meanwhile, assume that the start of the reform successfully allowed some rural youth specifically to change their fate. So to maybe to realize of this mobilization, upward mobilization. So, but in my study, I actually am able to show a lot of nuances regarding this conversation about the fate or mean. And for example, the male research participants who succeeded in the exams, their narratives focus on their adjustment to the individualistic value orientation and an emerging sense of uncertainty brought forward by the mechanism of competition. So they would feature a lot of the tensions. They would feature a lot of the conflicts in their mind about whether I should go join the collectivist labor. I should go to do some review my work, my academic work to prepare for these exams. But for women who succeeded in the exams, constantly marginalized in testing and re-entering school, as they were they are still constantly marginalized in the testing and the re-entering schools, as their patriarchal families and the educational system contested to assert control over their bodies. As a result, their fate-changing endeavors were very often compromised, even though they stood out among their peers in on academic performance. So that means even though those female, those women who stood out in their academic performance, they still they need to navigate this the two, like the family system and the school system. Excuse me. Both try to marginalize them, and their endeavor to change their fate, so to speak, was constantly compromised. And for those who failed or missed the exams, they tend to admit their fate as what it is, namely being peasant in the countryside, even though some of them were able to succeed in the later marketization process and cross the rural-urban divide. They still surprisingly constructed a narrative of a failure, centering on not being able to change their fate. So here, we can see what is the standard of changing one's fate and what is considered as the most valuable um, um, approach to do that. So these are one of the most foregrounded findings from the study I want to talk about. And I want to talk about why this finding matters. So it problematizes the contemporary myth of changing fate. And I think the narrative is both gender blind and belonging to those who benefited from the educational reform launched in the 1977. And also it brought people's attention to the experience and the voices of those whose experiences were marginalized and forgotten in today's China. It also revealed the complexities in the origin and the rise of meritocracy in post-Mao China. And yeah, I'm still working on the book manuscript, and I think it probably will take me some time to complete it. And well, thank you for being here with me, and that's pretty much about the project. And now I'm happy to have answer your questions or engage in a dialogue.
Pengfei, I want to say thank you so much on behalf of IIQM for this presentation. I found it fascinating. I know that I haven't seen any questions come into the chat window, but I actually have a couple of questions for you, and maybe we'll lead us off on this.
Oh, cool.
Interestingly enough, my own dad is part of a cohort, an entire university that immigrated from Hungary to University of British Columbia in 1957. So very similar kind of cohort to what you're talking about here. And I note in growing up with a dad who went through a similar kind of major shift in his social structures and his social understanding, and in it wasn't, and actually he didn't finish university in that University of British Columbia program. He was one of those who went out, saw the opportunities here in Canada, and went to work. He was a forester. So BC, it was forested everywhere. So one of the questions that I have, do you feel that you would have been as successful as you were in this time period in your interviews and in the answers now than if you had tried to do this kind of work maybe 20 or 30 years ago? Do you think there's a difference now in terms of people's willingness and ability to speak about what they went through?
So I think, you know, it's actually some of my research participants, when I chatted with them, you know, like a lot of informal chat, and they would say something like, I wouldn't let you know this. I wouldn't be happy to talk about this if I were younger. Because,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Because like now they were in, I mean, when they were doing the interview with me, they were in their either mostly in their late 50s, and now they are in their early 60s.
Yeah.
So there is definitely this sense of looking back and reflecting upon their life, almost like, you know, a lot of them retired maybe just a few years before, a few years after I interviewed them. So there is this sense of looking back to see what's my life, like what life enabled me to do, what I accomplished, or what are some of the things I regretted. So yeah, so maybe it's true. But I also want to comment on one thing, which is, you know, like I talked about there are quite some studies about urban youth in like urban Chinese youth, and the issue is that for like China has gone through this gradually opening its gate, so to speak, like process. And at the very beginning, like researchers, especially researchers from overseas, had very much limited access to the youth, like the generation that went through the Cultural Revolution. That like so to speak, like maybe 20 or 30 years ago, if I was doing this study, I don't know if I would encounter some roadblocks or, you know, some issues like that. And well, you know, people say China now is trying to tighten its regulation, so maybe we're going back. You know.
Interesting. Thank you. I do have a question now from Richard Heller and then another from Bonnie. So we'll start with Richard's. What did you do in regards to informed consent with your participants?
That's a wonderful question. And you know, as a methodologist, we always tell our students that the informed consent is not only about those paper, it's about a continuous consenting process. So I think, I think for me, when I was going through the RRB process, they asked for oral consent. But what I would do is I would always like give them the information and let them know that this is what I'm going to do and this is what I'm going to do, like what I plan to do with the data. But I would always check in with them through the process because it's a pretty long process. Like I mostly went back to their to my site during the summers, and I want to be like, I was mindful that they agreed at the very beginning doesn't mean that they would agree with me next time. And also, I want to be a little bit, I was trying, I endeavored to be a little bit more mindful about some of the research participants. They are like talking about their current social statuses. They are more vulnerable compared with others, like in terms of their social positions, whether they are peasants or whether they are retired officials. So that makes a difference in terms of like how much they would like to share. And also, if they are pretty open to share, I want to keep in mind that they are sharing with me some of the pretty sensitive topics and about their private life.
Thank you so much, Pengfei. I have another question now from Bonnie. She says, fate is a deep-seated concept in Chinese culture. Did you have a chance to delve into the etymology of that concept?
Yes, I wish I could include this. I have a like pretty complicated figure to demonstrate, it's more like the historical evolvement of this term. So I did quite some search in the databases. I mean, for a while, I feel like I almost turned myself into a linguistic or something. But, but yeah, but then I realized, like in ancient China, starting from modern 2000, modern like almost 3,000 years ago, you could find some talk of some discourse about the fate. And I was able to trace some of the development from like the very beginning to, the modern era, and even how, in China today, like in modern China, when we talk about the revolution is like in China, in Chinese revolution is 革命. It's like the translation, they translated it from Japanese, and people in Japan translated it from France. So the literal meaning of 革命 in China is changing fate. So like see like I pretty much see like in the period I was dealing with, there is two parallel meanings about 革命, where it's a very collectivist, violent movement based on some collective mobilization. But when people talk about changing fate through merit-based examinations, it's like on a totally different sense of like fate is interpreted as something very personal and something very individualized and something you could achieve through this institutionalized route.
Wonderful, thank you. One more question. In your, on one of your slides, you refer briefly to a journal article on fieldwork in authoritarian states.
Oh yeah.
Is this an article in development or has it been published? Tell us a little more about that.
Oh, that's in an R&R stage.
Okay, so it's coming.
Yes, well, I think I just finished my second round of revision and I submitted, so I think it's probably coming. Like fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. I would
Yeah,
be very interested to see that.
scientific.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So,
Maybe I'll have
let
to
me.
ask our IIQM director if we can circle back to a second webinar about that topic,
I'd
right?
love to.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like I mainly talk about some of the Isn't I mean like people probably would imagine dealing with such a topic, there would be some institutionalized censorship.
Mm-hmm.
But I was in this specific article, I was talking about some of the self-censorship I
Interesting.
encountered. Yeah,
Yeah.
like like in general, in not like a public space, but in a private space, it's not so much a taboo to talk about it, especially if it's related with your own life. But sometimes, like people tend to draw a line between what they can talk and what they cannot talk.
Yes.
And I found that's very interesting and nuanced in a lot of ways. And also, I realized that, like, see, this is a place where I realized some of the research participants with different social statuses or with different genders, they tend to deal with this differently. So I talk about some of the ethical challenges I encountered there and how I think through it.
I'm really eager to see and hear more about this. So
I'll keep
I
you
think,
in the loop.
and seeing no more questions in the chat window, I think now I'm going to unmute everyone to give all our participants an opportunity to interact with you, at least by voice. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute you all. You're all free to use your microphones if you should so choose. So please, we'd welcome any comments.
And thank you everyone for being here.
And people seem to be a little bit on the quiet side. I'll give it another 30 seconds or so. In that time period, what I will do is let you all know, again, a huge thank you to Pengfei for
Oh,
working through
for
all of this process for us. And a thank you also from atlas.ti, who were our sponsor for this dissertation award. And a thank you to atlas.ti for sponsoring this in 2017, for certain. IIQM itself, I'd like to just put into the chat window, we will be posting this video as an archive. I've put in our chat window, this is where you can find all of the IIQM webinars. And for those of you who are familiar, of course, we've been doing webinars at IIQM now for, I think it's been 8 years. We have a deep and broad archive of qualitative and mixed methods webinars available. This will also be available there under the Dissertation Awards tab, so please feel free to check that out. For those of you that have not heard the news, we did have a conference upcoming this June. We sadly had to make the hard choice of not doing a virtual conference, but instead have the exciting announcement, and for those that it is news for, it's big news. TQ, Thinking Qualitatively, is on the move. We are going to Kelowna, British Columbia in Canada next year, which is looking very similar to Pengfei's background, actually. It's wine growing country. And
yeah.
beautiful, it's a beautiful part of the country. So a lot of wonderful things to do and see in Kelowna, and we're really grateful to the University of British Columbia Okanagan, who's going to be hosting us next July 5th through 10th. So keep your eyes open for postings on abstract submission and more details about that to come from IIQM. If no one else has any questions, I will say again, thank you to Pengfei.
Well, thank you, Juliana, and thank you everyone for making this happen. And I want to thank you all for the questions as well. Like I benefited a lot from the questions, and I'm still in the process of exploring them. So if you want to like follow up with some more dialogues or conversations, feel free to reach me, and I would appreciate that.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you, everyone. And again, I'll have this Pengfei's slides and a recording up on our website within the week. So Pengfei, again, thank you.
Thank you.
Take
Thanks,
care.
everyone.
Bye now.
Bye.